welcome to the Transcendent Knowledge Podcast, episode number 20. And this is going to be the next part of our ongoing deconstruction of James Kent's Final 10 podcast series, which is part of his DoseNation podcast, where he is critiquing popular psychedelic discourse somewhat similar to the way that we have been in this podcast. So in the last episode, we covered episodes 4 and 5 of the Final 10 series, where Kent is mostly concerned with popular spirituality as opposed to popular psychedelia, although there was certainly a lot of overlap between the two. So having finished that, this time we will have a look at episode 6 and then just see how far we go. And this episode, that is James Kent's episode 6, is mostly about the whole kind of ayahuasca, South American shamanism thing as a part of pop psychedelia. And I think that's important because I think when in the earlier episodes of the Transcendent Knowledge podcast, when we were going systematically through all of these different paradigms or approaches that are part of pop psychedelia, the way that they interpret and deal with the whole psychedelic issue. And one very distinct, quite well circumscribed paradigm within that collection was this whole thing of South American rainforest shamanism and ayahuasca. And I think that, I was thinking that it would certainly be worth you and I doing an episode about that at some point, in the same way that we were doing individual episodes about these individual pop psych paradigms. But we haven't got around to that yet. But this podcast from James Kent gives us quite a good opportunity to cover all the important issues. So it's basically the central structure that James Kent is critiquing in episode 6 is the kind of master-student relationship. And he makes a very valid, very important point that you see this in, it's very prominent within the whole ayahuasca shamanism scene. And it's not very in other areas of pop psychedelia. And he relates this to being like a modern thing, whereas like in the old school days of psychedelia back in the 60s, they didn't have this. I mean, sure, there were acid gurus back in the 60s, people like Tim Leary addressing large crowds of people, but you didn't really have this thing of a shaman as a kind of trip sitter and trip entertainer back then. That's only come much more recently, since the discovery of South American shamanism. And James Kent gives the example of, I forget the name of the writer, William Burroughs, the guy's name. He went to South America and he wrote this book called the Yahe Letters. Yahe is another name for ayahuasca. And he said that, James Kent said that was really the first Western exposure, the first discovery in the popular narrative of the whole ayahuasca thing. So it's like in the 60s when everybody was taking LSD, nobody really knew that people were taking these other strange rainforest plant cocktails in the South American jungles. And there wasn't really that awareness back then. And that really fed the idea that they had in the 60s, that what they were doing was completely new, that they had discovered something that nobody had ever known about before. And it was only sometime after that when these other traditions were discovered, so-called primitive traditions, in primitive cultures of people taking ayahuasca, that actually they realized that the psychedelic experience has a longer history than simply the 60s. So James Kent makes the point that of all of the psychedelic drugs, ayahuasca is really one of the more recent discoveries. So it's been discovered more recently than than LSD was. I'm not exactly sure how true that is when you really kind of think about the chemical behind it, because after all, in 1967, when LSD was made illegal in the States, they also made psilocybin and DMT illegal at the same time. So there has to have been some awareness, at least of DMT, which is the active constituent of ayahuasca. But anyway, back to this theme of the kind of master-student relationship. So James Kent very accurately recognizes that is present in the ayahuasca scene, where it isn't really relevant, isn't really present anywhere else in the whole pop psychedelia scene. And it's become such a strong thing. There's been an explosion in awareness and participation in the whole South American scene. So on the one hand, certain areas in South America have become very popular tourist hubs for many thousands of people every year go and visit these places. And even many Western people have moved there and set up businesses, set up ayahuasca retreat centers in places like Iquitos in Peru. And there are also places in Brazil, even Guatemala, places like that, where you can travel and go and take ayahuasca in ceremonies. And also, there has been a migration out of South America of the plants, and not just the plants, but also the kind of shamanistic setting and the shamanic practice and this whole kind of shaman as trip sitter method of taking a psychedelic drug in a ceremony. That has also come out of South America and spread around the Western world. So now it's very easy to obtain the plants to make ayahuasca in the West, and then people have their own ceremonies where they have Western shamans, people who are to some extent schooled in the South American traditions, taking ceremonies. So this is a very big phenomenon that James Kent is addressing here. And what he says, one of the key claims he makes, is that it's unique in the pop psychedelic discourse because of this unique role of shamans, because the shaman is actually a human being who has a special status, who is involved in people's exploration of the psychedelic state of consciousness. And he likens shamans to gurus, because he starts off the podcast talking about gurus, which is not really an explicitly psychedelic or drug-related concept. The concept of guru comes from India, and it's more related to drug-free spirituality. It's more like 1970s neo-prohibitionist kind of spirituality.
Right, all you need is meditation.
Right. Or yoga, or all sorts of crazy practices people were flocking to India to go and do. I think that the Beatles are a good example of that trajectory, where they took a load of acid in the 60s and then they quote unquote outgrew psychedelic drugs in the 70s, and they went to India to do these drug-free things. Richard Alpert, aka Ram Dass, he's another very good example of that very typical, very well-worn trajectory from immature drug use and hedonism to mature, serious, sitting cross-legged, but sober, definitely
right.
sober spirituality.
Right. And Kent seems primarily interested in what, he talks about gurus preaching, kind of like almost, like group think instead of, they talk about personal empowerment, but what they end up creating is group think, which I think is what seems like that's Kent's primary focus, or like ire against gurus.
Exactly, yeah. That's the point he makes about gurus right at the start, that it becomes a form of mind control because they're getting a large group of people to all think the same way, chant the same chants, sit in the same position, that kind of thing. It's very much about conformism. And then Kent makes the link from guru to ayahuasca shaman, where he says that the shaman effectively takes on the role of the guru or the teacher or the guide, something like that, a role of higher responsibility than the person who is going to the shaman to make use of their services and their drugs.
I had a question about that. No, I'm not especially familiar on how the shamans present themselves, or how Western books on shamans present the shamans. But the guru model involves usually the people who are following the guru ascribe to that guru a level of moral perfection or moral advancement. They're very enlightened, and everything they say and do is perfectly morally advanced, spiritually advanced, so to speak. Is that part of the... I didn't hear James Kent say this, and it's something I've been wondering. Is that part of how shamans in the ayahuasca ceremonies are presented, that they're morally perfect? Because I bring it up because Kent... this is a thread throughout the episode. I don't want to give away our presentation here, but this is a thread throughout the episode that the shamans are not actually morally perfect beings. And I wondered where this was coming from. Is this just coming from because he's trying to associate them with gurus, where that is part of our general cultural association, that you follow a guru because you're trying to achieve moral, perfection? Is that the case with shamans? So they present, in your experience, do they present themselves that way?
So in other words, you're asking how valid is Kent's comparison between the morally perfect guru and the psychedelic
who
shaman?
Is there? I mean, it seems like the shaman is there to guide the trip and lead a ceremony and prepare the brew. Perhaps in the ayahuasca tradition, they have the special access to the brew. I'm no expert on any of this, but it doesn't occur to me when I think of ayahuasca shaman with being guiding people to a moral, that kind of moral perfection that a lot of, that it seems to me a lot of sober meditation is almost obsessed with, becoming a more enlightened being or whatever.
Right. That's an interesting question. I mean, there's different ideas there, because on the one hand, it's the degree of enlightenment that the shaman or the guru has, but then it's also the degree of moral perfection that the guru or the shaman has, but they're not necessarily the same thing.
No, certainly from our perspective, I think what I'm trying to talk about is the public perception, or oftentimes the way we conflate enlightenment with moral perfection in popular culture. These are often conflated. I go to the guru because I want to learn to be a better person, so to speak. And that person has the key to it. They're this enlightened person from the East. This is at least the narrative in the 70s, especially. From a Westerner goes to them because they want to learn the special wisdom of moral perfection from the East. And that seemed to be a key thing that to me, that Kent was trying to link gurus and shamans together in that, and then hold the shamans responsible because they're not, they fail or something at being morally perfect beings. But are they even trying to be, was my question, I think.
From my experience of that scene, I don't think I've ever particularly heard any concept of moral perfection or superior moral standing coming into it. There's certainly something which shamans are, a property that they are imbued with, that they are attributed to, which is superior. But I don't think it's concerned with morality. It's more about a kind of practical ability to deal with the altered state, and it's about the relationship to the altered state and the ability to guide people through it rather than an ordinary state-based thing. Although, I mean, it's part of a broader point that Kent certainly recognizes, and I think he's right to recognize in this podcast, that there's an awful lot of kind of inflated, hyperbolic thinking around the role of the shaman. And Kent doesn't, there's a way that I characterize it, which I'm disappointed to not hear in James Kent. But the way I would say it is that it's as if there's two things. What you have is, when you take psychedelic drugs, you get an august, elevated, spiritually elevated experience. And I think what has happened is that spiritual elevation, or whatever you want to call it, I mean, obviously we would just call it the degree of loosening cognition that you get from the experience, has been artificially projected onto a person. So people have taken a way of describing the altered state experience, and they're using those kinds of methods of description to describe a person, the shaman, rather than the experience. So in other words, it's a misplaced focus. People put their focus all on this guy who's standing at the front of the ceremony, giving out drugs and singing songs and that kind of thing. Whereas the really important thing that's in some way distracting them from is the experience that they're having. So I think there's a kind of an overlap, and I want to be careful not to get too jumbled up here, because I have to say that I think in this I agree with James Kent in episode 6 to a higher extent than I agree with him in any of the other episodes. I think he's more on the mark when he talks about psychedelic shamanism, South American ayahuasca shamanism, than he is when he talks about other elements of pop psychedelia. So it's why I want to kind of give my view on it. I want more than I generally do when we're talking about the other elements of James Kent's thinking. I guess this goes back to what I said at the beginning about how I had always kind of hoped that one day you and I would end up doing an episode of this podcast dedicated to ayahuasca shamanism, and we haven't done that yet. And now we're addressing the same issue, but through the lens of James Kent. And I want to be careful to kind of keep the two things separate. So there's like what I think about South American shamanism only partially overlaps with what James Kent observes about it.
But you agree that there's this kind of hyper focus on the figure of the shaman, and that's really what James Kent is trying to get at here by comparing them to gurus, that they take out, they're given this elevated status, and maybe they shouldn't have such elevated status. They're not doing all those things that people are ascribing to them.
Yes, I absolutely agree with that. It almost reaches the level of worship. There's a kind of a mystique projected around shamans, which is in some cases maybe warranted, but in some cases it's not warranted. I mean, okay, from my experience of the South American ayahuasca scene, it's like anybody really can call themselves a shaman. There's no kind of official body of accreditation, but to be a real shaman, like there is a fairly well recognized thing of actually how to genuinely earn your stripes as a shaman. And it's really hardcore. Like it involves sustained, extremely heavy use of various plants, especially ayahuasca and tobacco, many hundreds of ceremonies. Because I was talking to a shaman that I used to drink ayahuasca with about his training, and he described things like because ayahuasca makes you defecate and vomit at the same time, sometimes copiously. And he was telling me that for one of his things, he had to take ayahuasca in a ceremony and he was not allowed to vomit or defecate. So had a really, crazy things like that, and spending long periods of time, out in the wilderness. Like you have to be put through your paces to get the kind of responsibility legitimately to be able to guide ceremonies, put it that way. So there is, to some extent, the role of the shaman and the mystique that they have is earned, but it's definitely overdone. And I think that's what Kent recognizes as well, is that they are attributed almost godlike powers, like some kind of amazing mastership of healing powers, and that they can cast spells and curses and all these kind of things. And it's wild, the kind of crazy mystical magical powers that sometimes get attributed to shamans. So it's a mixed bag there.
And you mentioned that almost anyone could claim to be a shaman.
Yeah, you could in theory. It's not, and this brings me on to the next point of James Kent, and this is another very important point regarding official accreditation. He compares it to Western culture, where in order to become a medical doctor, where you've got MD after your name, you've got to earn your stripes with a very, very firmly established official body. You've got to do examinations, and it's get official qualifications. Like the whole academic university system, it's all rigidly structured system of intellectuals who all agree on the basic the requirement of becoming, whether it's a medical doctor or a professor or something like that. And Kent's point is there's no real equivalent of that in the South American rainforest. He's very much an adherent of the kind of primitivism idea, that these people are... It's the same as what he said before we've covered in earlier episodes about how psychedelic tripping is not compatible with modern Western culture, which is why you have to go to non-modern, primitive, non-Western culture. There's something archaic and old-fashioned and, this is how Westerners used to be thousands of years ago, and there's these people in the world that still have those values. They haven't evolved beyond that to our advanced Western modern status. They're still stuck in the past. So it's a primitivist idea. He's saying that shamans... There's no official accreditation establishment in the rainforest. You don't have university buildings or that kind of thing. It's all primitive compared to us structured modernists, right? So that is a core criticism for Kent of the psychedelic shaman scene, is that they're not answerable to an official body, and that has very serious consequences, which Kent gets into later on. So, this is the most recent psychedelic drug in the Western context, and there's been a very recent explosion in popularity. And there's another point that I think I would be very keen to emphasize, but which Kent misses, and it's a shame that he misses this, which is the comparison to the 60s attitude, where in the 60s it was all about fun and hedonism, and then because it was the fault of the users, the fault of these hedonistic recreational users, that prohibition came about. And that now this modern context of psychedelic use is a response to that, and they want to be taken seriously. They don't want to fall into the same trap that the 60s generation did. So they bend over backwards trying to make it look like what they're doing is responsible. They're not having any fun. And I think ayahuasca fits so perfectly into that, because it actually isn't really very fun when you're vomiting and defecating and also tripping balls at the same time. That's quite uncomfortable and quite hardcore. And it's no way near as easy to have what you would describe as a recreational experience on ayahuasca compared to LSD, put it that way.
But then, wait, your point here about it being so like rationalized as being good and serious, right, ties into the idea that all that defecating and vomiting is part of cleansing, purging and cleansing, and that this is both a physical and also a somehow mental or spiritual cleansing.
Yes, exactly. And I talked earlier about misplaced focus. This is another area where I have observed that in talking to people who have participated in ayahuasca ceremonies. You can ask a person, how did your ayahuasca ceremony go? And they will tell you all about the defecating and the vomiting, and they won't say anything about the loose cognition. And it was so wonderfully cleansing. I was sitting on a toilet shitting all night. Like how cleansing. But they don't say anything about loose cognition or mental reprogramming, that kind of thing. So an awful lot of misplaced focus. But again, that's my perspective much more than James Kent's in that regard, although there is some overlap there.
No, it reminds me of kind of the health food scene, at least in the States, has a lot on cleansing and purging, all juice diets to like clean out toxins, so to speak, from the body. And it's all, of dubious like truth or dubious attachment to real health. Who knows?
Yeah, certainly not backed up by the the official medical doctors. This is all just speculation and hyperbole coming out of the rainforest. So like I once went to an ayahuasca retreat place in Peru, and it's like the diet is another major part of the whole experience. They basically feed you like rice and a little bit of fruit, but it's incredibly bland. No fat, no sugar, no salt. And it's after eating like that for a couple of days, you really are focused on eating every day. Like it becomes a major part of the experience. It's like an enforced fasting. And again, you talk to people that do these kind of things and they talk for hours about the diet that they eat, put far more emphasis on that than they do on the altered state experiencing element of it all.
Yeah. So it's less about the psychedelics and more about the self-enforced like pain and suffering of it all.
Yeah, it's like asceticism, right? Religious asceticism. It has that whole thing, like in India, you see people like whipping themselves and fasting for days on end. It's like making yourself suffer is a spiritual thing. And that obviously has an important analogical overlap with what we've said about the importance of bad trips, unpleasant experiences. It's kind of like a misinterpretation of that. It's like we are suffering, so we're doing something spiritual. I once at an ayahuasca ceremony in Holland, I heard one of the shaman guys say, "Oh, you come here, you suffer, and then you go home," kind of thing. It's like, don't ever talk about having a nice time at an ayahuasca ceremony, because that's a heresy kind of thing. So that's a kind of general overview of the scene and of James Kent's attitude towards shamans. He's skeptical of shamans because they claim a superior knowledge, superior understanding, superior ability, but that superiority is not accountable to an official body, in a nutshell.
Right.
And then,
no, I did want to add here, since we have in the past criticized him for James Kent for not really presenting the targets of his criticism in a fair way, but I thought he was quite fair in discussing physical healing and shamanism, elements of the purging, etc., as actual physical healing for a certain sort of jungle-based community, jungle-based lifestyle. He actually had a presentation of like, well, why would medicine in the jungle develop in certain ways and have certain characteristics? And he's saying, well, the ayahuasca ceremony is wrapped up in the sort of medical treatment that people living in the jungle are going to need, which is like occasionally purging the body of unclean water and unclean food and things like that. And I thought that was actually, again, I just want to praise James Kent there after trashing him in previous episodes for not being very fair. I thought this was an extremely balanced presentation of the different cultural contexts in which the concept of healing and medicine, of physical health, would develop. So I was, again, I think I share with you a lot of agreement here in this episode with James Kent. As I've mentioned, I'm not extremely familiar with the whole scene, but so I feel like I'm very much an outsider looking at it. But I did like that, and of course, from our point of view, mere physical healing isn't really the main point of the concept of healing. But we'd also say that most people talking about ayahuasca ceremonies are also not focusing on the metaphorical meaning of healing as somehow about the relationship between the local control source and the ultimate source, and healing that relationship, or the ego death potential as a nagging wound or limp or ongoing illness or something like that, and that we get healed from that by building up and turning to the eternalism model. I mean, I don't sense that from what encounters I have had with the ayahuasca scene or discourse. I don't sense much awareness of that kind of analogical meaning of what is shamanic healing, the shamanic claims to heal. I don't see much of that kind of an explicit discussion of a metaphorical meaning to that healing.
Right. I think that is a really central point, because of how absolutely central that word healing is within that whole scene. It's all about healing, and you'll hear the word healing everywhere you go in the ayahuasca scene. You take ayahuasca to heal. It's a medicine. It's jungle medicine meant for healing, except that they never ever really spell out in any kind of understandable, logical and consistent sense what that word healing actually means. And I think it's exactly the same criticism that we're making about the word healing that we have in previous episodes made about the word benefits. I think, the word benefits comes more in the Western context of using psychedelic drugs in psychotherapy. But what we're talking about here in shamanism is an interpretation of shamanism that basically interprets it as primitive psychotherapy for rainforest natives. It's basically the same thing. You do psychedelic psychotherapy to heal in the modern context of getting the psychotherapeutic benefits, and you take ayahuasca in the ayahuasca shamanism setting to get the healing benefits of the ayahuasca.
Interesting. And that is on a kind of, ayahuasca tradition would describe it as being like, there's evil spirits or something like that are plaguing a person that need to be healed from or cast out or something like that.
Yes, there's a strong animist philosophy, which really permeates the whole scene, even across diverse, because you get all these widely diverse set of practices. There's no single practice that is called the official ayahuasca shamanism, but I would say that animism is one of the most broadly distributed ways of seeing the world that they have. So yeah, it's about spirits and that kind of thing. That's something, another word you hear all the time is spirits in the South American scene. And sometimes also things like getting over curses that other shamans have put on you and that kind of thing. So there's a large witchcraft element to it, of like cursing and counter cursing and healing from curses and that kind of thing. So there's these. So I suppose, yeah, to some extent there is an account of what healing means, but any attempt to account for what this word healing means in that scene falls far short of a recognition of cybernetic deterministic metaphor, which you and I can immediately recognize in these kind of things. So you got the point that chemically ayahuasca is strongly purgative. It makes your body evacuate fluids. That's one, as well as making you trip. And that purgative potential is something that you can weave into the narrative of primitive native use, because in their primitive native living environment, they're constantly getting amoeba and insects and whatever inside their bodies, various infections and that kind of thing, parasites, whatever. So they use ayahuasca as a purgative to rid their body of parasites and foreign organisms. But then that leads to so Kent adopts that point of view of saying that ayahuasca is a purgative, and its original context for the natives is a purgative rather than a psychedelic. So he has to adopt the somewhat highly tendentious, quite striking claim that ayahuasca is ritual poisoning, and he uses that exact phrase. He says that an ayahuasca ceremony is a ritual poisoning, and ayahuasca is primarily a poison. So therefore he's forced to say that the hallucinogenic and recreational and potentially mystical properties are merely incidental. He doesn't really spell that out, but I think that you can clearly derive that argument from what he says, that he seems to think that, even though that seems like a bizarre claim given the majesty and the structure and the profundity of this hallucinogenic psychedelic effect. To say that is merely an incidental side effect of something which is actually supposed to clear your body of foreign infections or whatever seems really strange.
Oh, I see. I hadn't really picked up on that before. That's an interesting point, that because he's such a scientific materialist, that he ends up presenting, all he focuses on is like, well, what physical effect does this drug have? And then he makes that the main point, that's how it developed. Its usage developed in the first place solely because of that. And I see what you're saying. It creates this very distorted, we're supposed to then agree again, he doesn't spell it out in the way you just did, because I think it would become untenable when put that way, right? That like, oh, they just started combining these drugs to create a purgative effect, and then actually after that, that's when all this like psychedelic hallucinogen stuff started happening and grew up around that. But really, at the core, it's just a purgative effect.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So it's, it's like you can criticize the ayahuasca shamanism scene for misplaced focus, but I also think that James Kent is committing the same mistake of putting the focus in the wrong place, trying to overemphasize these physical side effects of ayahuasca at the expense of the loose cognitive side. And I actually have to say that, again, this is something that I'm bringing to the table from my observations, that that is partly the fault of the fact that actually I think ayahuasca itself is a very unergonomic drug in the specifically loose cognitive sense. So it's a very crude, imprecise mixture of whatever plants your shaman or whatever wants to include. And there are certain basic essential plants, but even then the dosage is all over the place, and you never really know what you're getting in terms of pure psychedelic chemicals when you drink a cup of ayahuasca. It's just a very crude plant concoction is basically what I'm saying. And I think that property of ayahuasca actually distinguishes it from the far more ergonomic psychedelic drugs like magic mushrooms and LSD and those kind of things. It's like you certainly can get incredibly, the full range of loose cognition effects from ayahuasca, but it's much more dependent on the way that the ayahuasca was prepared in the first place, and the kind of expertise about how to do that in a really optimally psychedelic way is not very widespread. So in other words, if you want to have an experience where you're going to vomit and defecate a lot, then ayahuasca is a very good option. But if you want to have an experience where you're certain that you're going to actually trip and have a cognitive effect, actually ayahuasca is not the best option for psychedelic drugs. And I think there's no recognition of that point in pop psych. They are very wholeheartedly enthusiastic about ayahuasca despite this limitation. They ignore this limitation. And I think that's partly to blame for why there is such a misplaced focus, misplaced emphasis on talking about things other than the loose cognition, as if they are more important than the loose cognition. Like the asceticism, the fasting, the vomiting, that kind of thing. So we've got this overly strong emphasis on ayahuasca's physical properties. And next, Kent goes into a long tirade about a man named Donald Topping, who wrote an article for MAPS, I think the MAPS website or the MAPS journal, in 1998, relating to the potential for ayahuasca to cure cancer. And I think, again, here, I'm strongly in agreement with what James Kent is getting at here. This is a terrible thing, and it's crazy that this has happened in pop psychedelia. It's a true mark of just how blind the pop psychedelia scene is, that they are so willing to jump on these kind of these kind of promises about psychedelic drugs. So this guy Donald Topping had liver cancer, and he came under the idea, somehow got the idea that ayahuasca is a medical panacea cure-all that will cure absolutely everything. So he wanted to take it instead of doing the Western treatment for liver cancer, like chemotherapy, radiotherapy, that kind of thing. And instead, suffering with cancer, he went to the rainforest and took ayahuasca to try to, as if there was any reason to believe that drinking ayahuasca in the rainforest is going to have any effect whatsoever on cancer. And he said that Donald Topping knew better than his oncologist. And I think that's another reference to this whole accreditation issue. It's like this guy Donald Topping put shamanism ahead of ahead of Western medicine, and that for Kent is a big no-no, a big heresy, an affront to the superiority of modern Western culture. So, and I think this is a really good example. And again, from my own personal experience of the ayahuasca scene, this is something that I have observed too. When I was in Peru, I went to go and do a San Pedro ceremony in some remote place that outside of Iquitos. And there was a woman that came with the group I was with who had very advanced HIV. And you could see just from looking at her that she was a very ill person. And she had come all the way out here. She was from France to try to treat her HIV. And that's another false promise that like ayahuasca is going to cure cancer. These are false promises, and really horrible, dangerous false promises that you can imagine could have the potential to seriously devastate a person's life. If they seriously believed that ayahuasca has this property, which it very definitely doesn't. So, it's certainly true that if you were suffering from a terminal condition, you might get some kind of spiritual, quote unquote, benefit or good feelings from doing ayahuasca, but you're certainly not going to heal your condition from doing it. And clearly, some people have been sold a lie as far as that is concerned. And Kent uses this example of Donald Topping writing for MAPS to really emphasize that impressionable people suffering from cancer, desperate to find some kind of treatment, perhaps frustrated with how incredibly invasive and unpleasant the Western medical treatment for cancer is. So they try and find some alternative therapy, and they get the idea in their head that ayahuasca is going to help them, and it really isn't.
Right, and of course that's a broader trend. I don't know if that's the right word, but at least in America and probably in other Western countries, of looking for alternative medical sources to treat things. It's some idea that like Western medicine isn't actually going to treat it, but there's some other cure from some other medical tradition, so to speak, that is the real Ayurvedic or Chinese medicine, that is going to give the cure, and so we'll turn away from Western medicine because of its whatever reasons, and then turn to that. I mean, that's a broader thing that now ayahuasca has been wrapped up into. I think it's a different, again, it's a different cultural context for medicine that then people are almost like attributing with, well, that's what is really going to work. There's really a cure for cancer out there. I mean, it strikes me too, and it just occurred to me while you were talking about, if there's some sort of spiritual benefit of taking the ayahuasca for somebody and not a physical benefit. Well, it occurred to me that, I think the majority of the studies in the U.S. and coming out of Johns Hopkins University, they're when they have given psychedelics to cancer patients, their results are not about, and I don't think their goal is to prove any sort of like physical healing potential, but all that they're concluding or trying to conclude is that it provides some sort of like benefit, like what's the term they use, like end of life, like reconciliation with death, essentially. The people go to the Johns Hopkins Center who are terminally ill cancer patients. They take the psychedelic, and what they get out of it, according to their results, is essentially end of life, a reconciliation with the fact that they're going to die from cancer, a greater like ease of their mental well-being. So it's interesting that there isn't that claim. I mean, like the Johns Hopkins study, formal medical and scientific body in the U.S. is not interested in those questions at all.
What you're saying, that they downplay the importance of the kind of psychotherapeutic elements?
No, what I mean is that they're not interested in the I thought it was a striking like contrast that like the results, so to speak, that are coming out of there and being publicized out of there are just about a psychotherapeutic benefit. They're taking terminally ill cancer patients and giving them psychedelics, but the hope, the interest is not in whether or not they're going to be cured of cancer physically. Again, the point I'm trying to make is that at Johns Hopkins University, they're not interested in giving the psychedelic, and it just struck me as maybe not the point of the study, but a kind of contrast that in the Johns Hopkins unit there with psilocybin, what the results that they're publishing have nothing to do with physical healing, just with therapeutic benefit.
Yes.
For cancer patients, that they have a better end of life awareness or reconciliation with death, more than any sort of come to our center and be magically cured of cancer. There's no illusion there of that.
So Johns Hopkins are getting it right in that regard. I don't think James Kent would disagree with that, because he is actually positive. He is affirmative towards using psychedelics as psychotherapeutic aids, albeit in a very reluctant, reserved, and qualified way. He's very careful about how he qualifies those kind of statements, because that is going beyond recreational use, which makes him uncomfortable. So he doesn't go too far. But as far as that concerned, he wouldn't have a problem with Johns Hopkins' approach of giving psychedelic drugs to cancer patients for end of life issues. He's more the idea that it would cure cancer, which certainly Johns Hopkins are not saying. Although there is something that I identified slightly there, that maybe there's another case of misrecognition or failure to recognize metaphor when you talk about people with cancer will take psychedelics and they will reconcile with death, or they will come face to face with end of life issues. That sounds like it could be a metaphorical reference to end of life issues in terms of ego death experience.
No, absolutely. I think that's part of the question then is, well, why do psychedelics, what is it about psychedelics that allow for some sort of encounter with death? I mean, I think that would be the next question from a Johns Hopkins point of view that I would ask the people at Johns Hopkins they should investigate and try to explain. I mean, I fully agree with you about the metaphorical. It sounds like ego death. That's why they produce a feeling or sensation of reconciliation with death, is because you explore the end of the separate self, the end of independent free will. So in that sense, you could say that the ego death theory paves a pathway towards a theory of cancer benefit, a cancer patient benefits from psychedelic drugs, because John Hopkins states that there is a benefit, but I'm pretty sure that Johns Hopkins don't really try to propose a structured theory for what the benefit actually is and why there is a benefit from tripping for someone that has cancer. Whereas what you've just said, it's because they get to experience the dying experience in the mental ego death sense before they experience it in the physical, dying of cancer sense. That could be an explanation or an account of what that whole dynamic actually is, why cancer patients can quote unquote benefit from psychedelic tripping. But that's not something that James Kent doesn't go down that route. No. But and certainly then in the ayahuasca context, it is being allowed to. I think that some of Kent's frustration is that people are being allowed to think that there is a real physical healing, or even encouraged to think that. I mean, that MAPS would publish that article suggests that they want people to think that there is a physical benefit and a potential of curing cancer.
Yes, which I can certainly agree with Kent. That's not fair on people who might actually fall for that. It's wrong to misadvertise psychedelic drugs like that, and that could have very serious implications for somebody if they took it seriously. So Kent proceeds from there, from that kind of characterization of these false promises of ayahuasca as a universal panacea cure-all for all medical conditions, to making the extremely derogative claim that all ayahuasca tourism really is going on vacation to have recreational drug experiences. Nothing more serious or profound than that. That actually all these groups of tourists who flock to South America for spiritual experiences or spiritual healing, something like that. Actually, they're just going to go and get high in some foreign country. So he's totally disparaging. He goes from one extreme to the other. He goes from false promises that ayahuasca can cure cancer to ayahuasca can't do anything at all other than give you recreational drug experience. And all that really just comes down to the whole theme that permeates the whole of these 10 podcasts, which is he keeps on coming back to it and back to it, that psychedelic drugs are only recreational and they don't do anything after the trip ends. That's one of his main contentions. And he's simply reformulating that to apply it to the ayahuasca shamanism scene. So he says that the whole psycho-spiritual element that is tacked on to the ayahuasca tourism culture is actually just a lie to promote drug dealing. And that's what he says. He says that the ayahuasca shamans are just drug dealers and they call the experiences spiritual in order to market their drugs to gullible Westerners, which is a very similar accusation than what he made against Albert Hofmann, which we talked about 2 episodes ago. That he said with Albert Hofmann, he created a recreational drug and he was devastated that his drug was being used by hippie burnouts. So he created a fake veneer of religious mysticism to tack onto it, to call it something other than what it really is. And he is saying exactly the same thing about ayahuasca experiencing here, that it is not mystical experiencing, that it isn't really psycho-spiritual, it's actually just recreational drug taking and drug dealing.
Yes. Yep. Very very similar. I agree. Kind of similarly nihilistic and cynical, and viewing the figures as in a very cynical way, or the proponents of it, that they are very cynical and are just covering up their depravity. I mean, he keeps using that word, depravity. And it struck me, I mean, this would be such a larger topic, but, you know, in studying Michael Hoffman's work, that's where I first learned about the author and psychologist and I guess kind of anthropologist in a way, Benny Shannon, who we've mentioned in previous podcasts, do we want to talk about him a little bit?
Certainly could. Yeah, that's he's certainly relevant because he specializes in ayahuasca.
His book Antipodes of the Mind is a major book in that he was an Israeli psychologist, cognitive psychologist, employed at a university there, who somehow became familiar with ayahuasca at a very early stage. I think before it became popular. By early, I mean before it became very popular in the late 90s and early 2000s. And he then, in addition to his own experiences with ayahuasca in South America, he also essentially conducted, using his academic training, conducted a kind of anthropological study of the users that he knew, and then a cognitive psychological study or phenomenological study of his experiencing and of other people's experiencing as they reported it. And it is striking that Kent has nothing to say about that book. I wonder if he's read it or is familiar with it at all, because it certainly presents a more, there's a very robust, that there's somebody coming out of Benny Shannon coming out of the Western materialistic science training and science of the mind, coming out of that background and then encountering ayahuasca and its culture and its users, and a mind that becomes very experienced by Shannon's own admission, many ayahuasca ceremonies and trips, who then wrote this really in-depth book about the cognitive phenomenology of ayahuasca, and to have nothing to say about it and then conclude that the entirety of ayahuasca is just recreation, dressed up to lure in tourists and deal drugs to them, and then have nothing to say about this major book. It was baffling to me that it would be not mentioned in more detail.
This is a criticism that has come up before, that James Kent presents himself as being some widely read intellect of psychedelia, but actually there are some major gaps in his bibliographic knowledge. I hadn't actually realized that, but yes, that's a major hole in his understanding of ayahuasca, that he has not integrated the revelations from Benny Shannon's book. Whereas actually Benny Shannon, for the ego death theory, is a very important thinker, someone who Michael Hoffman has written a lot about, and who is very much aligned with the ego death theory way of thinking.
Mm-hmm. I agree. I wonder if there's, as I recall, Shannon writes that he entered the study and his encounters with ayahuasca from a reductionist materialist science viewpoint, and he left it with questions in his mind about the validity of that viewpoint, or of solely adhering to that viewpoint. That the ayahuasca experiencing made him question that materialist reductionist science as it's kind of literally, or not literally, as in its literalist understanding that kind of currently predominates the Western sciences and Western academy. And I wonder if that's either Kent looked at it and kind of threw the book away in disgust at somebody who would become slightly spiritual, or whatever term Kent would use. And I don't think I'd quite say that about Shannon, having read his book, but or just I don't know. I mean, that element is a challenge. Those combination of elements is a challenge to Kent's atheist, reductionist, materialist science.
Yeah, that's interesting, because it provides such a stark contrast between two people and the way that their understanding has been affected by psychedelic drugs. Like, obviously, Benny Shannon has been affected by his ayahuasca experiences very differently from how James Kent has been affected by his LSD experiences. So with James Kent, he remained a materialist reductionist, whereas with Benny Shannon, it weakened the foundations of his materialist reductionist mindset. So there's an interesting contrast there between LSD and ayahuasca, because LSD doesn't have an ancient cultural tradition attached to it, whereas LSD does, and that's certainly relevant to. Oh, sorry, ayahuasca does. Yeah, sorry, that's certainly a crucially relevant point in terms of connecting psychedelic drugs to religion and to religious traditions, but. Again, James Kent adopts this kind of broadly scorched earth attitude towards the whole thing. And he refers to ayahuasca ceremonies as being inherently dangerous. And then he makes a really important point. So he goes into details from basically mainstream media reports of the tiny number of horrifying accidents and horrifying occurrences that occur in South American ayahuasca ceremonies. Out of all the thousands of people who go there every year to participate in these ceremonies, inevitably, in a tiny number of cases, things go wrong, and you do get some quite grisly, horrific things when psychedelic ceremonies go wrong. So James Kent runs through these things about, like, some guy ripping another guy's heart out that was in a newspaper report, and all sorts of a guy who died in a tobacco ceremony, and then the shaman of the ceremony buried his body. Like, these are symptoms of the fact that whole culture, it's not modern. It's quite grotty, quite kind of dirty, and I don't want to fall into the trap of primitivism myself, but I'm kind of getting close to it now. But it's not what you would expect if you went to a Western psychotherapy inspired place. It's actually quite it's not as luxurious as that, and these are all kind of the kind of grotty edges of it where the really bad things happen. So James Kent then projects from that to saying that because of these horrific things that happen in some ayahuasca ceremonies, he says that ayahuasca ceremonies themselves are inherently dangerous. And this is the crucial part. He says that in what ayahuasca does is it reveals the true nature of the self. And what that true nature is unpredictable and prone to extreme loss of control. And that's clearly the case in the stories that he recounts. In particular, the one where some martial arts fighting guy apparently tore out another person's heart in the middle of a ayahuasca ceremony. So he makes a very crucial connection there between ayahuasca and unpredictability and loss of control, which obviously, from our point of view, is the great kind of mark of legitimacy that ayahuasca does bring you face to face with loss of control in the cybernetic and deterministic sense. But again, obviously, James Kent, not being equipped with the ego death theory, doesn't recognize that. And he just takes that to mean this is a bad thing, this is negative, this is dangerous, nobody should do it kind of thing. The scorched earth idea. Instead of trying to constructively understand the control loss experience, he just dismisses it as being too dangerous to go there, too hot to handle.
Exactly. Yeah, the worst thing that could happen, I have a quote here, the worst thing that could happen is losing control and becoming primal and violent. And that's profound in a certain way, and that losing control is the worst thing that could happen to the egoic control system in the altered state, which is trying to, is so wrapped up in the idea of being in control or being the decision maker, to then lose that control, have that control undermined and threatened, is the worst thing that could happen to the ego, to that whole system. I really started to view James Kent here as, he's interested in reinforcing that sense of, that feeling of control, and of not, there should be no threats to it, etc. And that affects or colors or underlies a lot of his approach here. His criticism is coming from, I think, from that background of individual control, personal control, something that has to be protected at all times, and so it doesn't let him see the ideas of grappling with that control loss potential and what's on the other side of that.
Right, as potentially being a route to spiritual enlightenment or metaphysical enlightenment. You made a very interesting point in the last recording, a very good characterization. You said that James Kent is kind of like the spokesperson for the ordinary state of consciousness, that he represents the ordinary state way of thinking, and a crucial part of that is a terrifying fear and revulsion of losing control.
Right. I thought that a lot of that came out in, especially a lot of his style of presenting at the end of the episode. It was the words I associate with. It's very sensationalistic. I mean, you mentioned like taking a few reports in journalism, in journal newspapers that are, often focused on the grisly and the brutal deaths and things like that, and then Kent adopts this attitude, this very sensationalistic, emotionalistic attitude of, won't you think of the poor mother of this child who has, been deprived of her son, who was killed in an ayahuasca ceremony. He starts cursing at various points, people who would ever defend ayahuasca ceremonies. And I felt, one of my reactions, I felt embarrassed for him to be behaving that way. And then, but secondly, I started to think how this like sensationalism about safety is, to me, really fits in with what I'm trying to define recently and think through recently as the culture of prohibition. It's got the kind of attitude that leads to or reinforces a prohibitionist mindset towards drugs, but more broadly towards the idea of encountering that problem of control. I think that prohibition culture writ large is set up around those dynamics of avoiding control loss and maintaining one's own individual sense of identity and integrity. But that's for a larger discussion. But that sensationalizing attitude and moralizing attitude really fits in with that. It's about how awful the shamans and their accomplices are morally, and how innocent the poor people who are being dragged into this situation are. And we should recoil in moral indignation at them.
Yes, yeah, self-right. He's fueled with self-righteous indignation at that point when he's criticizing these shamans.
Right. I think there's something in my own personal, I don't know, my personal background and culture that, I view that whole attitude and approach as really culturally retrograde. I mean, it reminds me of the like moral panics in the United States in the late 60s, 70s, the 1980s, don't dare to say no to drugs, all these campaigns, and, oh, we can't have, there's all these threats out there, and we need to protect ourselves from all these threats. And won't somebody think of the children? That that line from The Simpsons. You have the like Reverend's wife. Won't somebody please think of the children? It becomes this recurring gag of, I forget what she's talking about, but it's not a dangerous scenario at all. And so the children are invoked as a way to pass kind of moral legislation.
Yeah, protecting the integrity of childish egoic thinking.
Yes, yeah, that's a great way to put it. So yeah, it struck me as this I just don't align myself with being too focused on the problem of safety. That's a tricky line because it's, that's not advocating danger or death or casualty or anything like that. But I'm not particularly interested in the culture of safety, and I view it as really wrapped up in, again, this prohibition writ large, or kind of larger, broader culture of prohibition is hyper-focused on safety and security, and Kent really exemplifies that to me in a lot of his criticism of psychedelics, that they're too dangerous. And yeah, I mean, it strikes me as slightly, he's all about Western science and medicine and its development, and of course, there are lots of unsafe things that happen in the history of Western science and medicine, and he ends this episode by talking about, well, is this progress that there's? He's reviewing a handful of deaths that occur on ayahuasca or in a ceremony, and I think his progress thing is that it's now not like somebody in the jungle who's not being, the police have to get involved to even find the body, but now there's somebody who just died in somebody's apartment in a city, and they reported them, called 911, and he says, well, is this progress? Well, maybe, but it got me thinking about the whole, like, the progress. If you look at the history of Western science and medicine, it is full of really grisly things that happen as well to get to the point that, of knowledge, people digging up corpses to do experiments on them, dissecting people and things like that. I mean, I think what I'm trying to plug into a little bit here is this advanced versus primitive debate that, we're not so far away from that, so to speak, if we're positioning Western culture as advanced and civilized. There's been a lot of grisly things in its own history. That if we're just using the safety thing to beat up other cultures,